Wendy Pearlman is the Jane Long Professor of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Northwestern University. She earned her PhD from Harvard, has studied Arabic and the Arab world for 3 decades, and is the author of 6 books and more than 40 academic articles and book chapters on the Middle East. She'll tell you about some of these projects shortly. And without further ado, let me introduce Wendy Pearlman for Understanding Syria.
Okay, I was told the first thing I need to do is lower the microphone. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you to Josh and to the entire UNIUM community for welcoming me here to talk about one of my favorite topics to talk about, which is Syria. But this is the first talk that I'm getting to give to Syria here in the US after the fall of the Assad regime in December 2024, so it's especially exciting for me. So thank you for being here and help me think through elements that I'm really still even beginning to wrap my mind around. Because after 54 years of brutal dictatorship and 14 years of merciless war, Syrians have the chance to achieve their freedom. Today, I'd like to explore how Syria got here and what might lie ahead, and with a special focus on the human angle. And that's because over the past 13 years, I've conducted interviews with more than 550 Syrian refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. And now I can say also Syrians in Syria, where I visited last month. So people across 5 continents. I began this project in 2011 with a special interest in the Syrian uprising that began as a part of the Arab Spring. In 2017, I used the interviews, these human stories that I'd gathered up until that time to write this book, We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. It's a book that follows Syrians' experiences of uprising, war, and ends with the stories of people beginning to leave the country as refugees. But because the Syrian story did not end there, I kept doing interviews around the world, and I wrote a second book. There were copies outside. This book is called The Home I Work to Make, which was published in 2024, that begins with the stories of Syrians fleeing the war as refugees or migrants or asylum seekers, and then tracks their stories around the world as they reflect on losing home, searching for home, finding home, not finding home, and ultimately thinking and rethinking the meaning of home itself. So in this presentation, I'd like to share some voices from both of these books to give a sense of where Syria came from, as well as some observations on the current moment to help us understand where Syria is now and where it might be headed. But because I think that historical context is so important, I'll begin where the first book begins, which is the lived experience of authoritarianism. In 1970, after decades of coups and instability, General Hafez al-Assad seized power in a coup in Syria and established a strong authoritarian regime. He sought to win support through some policies of economic redistribution and social services, but allowed no space for criticism, used violence and threat of violence against all those who dared to criticize. And this repression was symbolized in the imprisonment of some hundreds of thousands of people as political prisoners, accused of opposing the regime or accused of knowing somebody who opposed the regime, and hundreds disappeared, tortured to death, or were never heard from again in these dungeon prisons. This repression was also embodied in the regime crackdown that killed tens of thousands of civilians in the city of Hama, and that's the picture of rubble you see there. This was an insurrection led by offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1982, and the regime sent in tanks and troops and flattened entire neighborhoods of the city, in many ways warning generations what would happen to them if they dared to speak out. The Syrian stories that I collected over these years describe how this regime was a situation in which a single ruling political party an omnipresent security apparatus, and a pervasive network of covert informants, all combined to police society and encourage society to police itself. Let me share with you the words of one of my interviewees, Elias, who described authoritarian Assad Syria in these words. He said, "Syria had the appearance of being a stable country, but in my opinion, it wasn't real stability. Nobody trusted anyone else. People would say, 'Don't talk, the walls have ears.' It's a regime based on command and obedience. Every state institution recreated the same kind of power. The president had absolute power in the country. The principal of a school had absolute power in the school. And at the same time, the principal is terrified. Of whom? Of the janitor sweeping the floors, because they're all government informants." Hafez died in the year 2000, and his son Bashar al-Assad inherited the presidency. Many believed that this young, educated head of state would make change, but violence and threat of violence remained, and in many ways, corruption, which had also been a part of the political system, even got worse in a regime without rule of law. And here, to give you the sense of corruption and how that was also a part of oppression and a part of the grievances of ordinary Syrians, let me share the words of Iham, who I also interviewed in the first book. And he said, "Even as an innocent child, you could see that the whole system just reeked. It fed on corruption and grew. If you want to get a passport, you have to bribe this guy and that guy. From when you're little, you're taught that this is the only way to survive in this country. As an active member of the ruling party, you're going to get better grades, better chances for better schools or jobs. Everything is handled by how loyal you are to the regime. So you're raised on the principle that you have to show your loyalty." The people I met, and whose stories are predominantly in the first book, describe pre-2011 Syria as a place where corruption and repression simply limited the horizons of possibility. To hope for change was foolish. To actually work for change, reckless. It would only get you and probably your family in the worst kinds of trouble. As expressed by one drama student, a Syrian citizen is just a number. Dreaming is not allowed. And then Syrians dared to dream. On the backdrop of uprisings elsewhere in the Arab world in 2011, in Syria, a few tentative demonstrations got off the ground, spread over space, were sustained over time, launched a national revolt that called first only for reform of the political system, and when it was met with violence from the government, called for the overthrow of the Assad regime. The first book traces that process in detail and also shares stories about what it meant to participate in protest. I think that essence is captured in an expression that became ubiquitous throughout Syria, that Syrians broke the barrier of fear, or كسروا حاجز الخوف. People who contributed to the revolution knew that they were risking death, but they mustered the capacity to act anyway. I would ask people to describe what it felt like to participate in protest demonstrations. And people would say, La Yusuf, it's simply indescribable. And I would say, I'm writing a book. I work in words. Can you try to describe it? People would say things like, it was the first time I breathed, the first time I felt like a human. One man said, it was better than my wedding day. And when my wife heard that, she refused to speak to me for a month. This sense that it was like the first time is expressed in ways I'll never forget here by Rima, who said, "I was in a demonstration and I started to whisper, 'Freedom.' And then I started to hear myself repeating, 'Freedom, freedom, freedom.' And I started shouting, 'Freedom.' And I thought, this is the first time I have ever heard my own voice. And I told myself that I would never let anyone steal my voice again." The uprising remained overwhelmingly nonviolent, with mass demonstrations for several months. The Assad regime responded with various forms of violence, including bullets, missiles, and mass arbitrary imprisonment. The opposition eventually took up arms, and the armed rebellion took over large swaths of the country as it forced government forces from different areas that then fell under regime or under rebel control. The regime then escalated its military violence to try to claw those areas back from rebel control, escalating to the use of aerial bombardment, chemical weapons, starvation, and siege tactics against civilian areas. And other states and non-state actors increased their involvement in this increasingly complicated, multidimensional war. And among some of the groups that emerged were those with an Islamist radical ideology, including what eventually became ISIS, which declared an Islamic State in areas of northeast Syria, which you can see here in pink, and over the border into Iraq. So we wound up with this fragmented map of territorial control that was shifting week by week, month by month, as the years passed, 2013, 14, 15, 16, and so forth. But increasingly by 2020, many referred to Syria as a frozen conflict. Assad had brutally taken back many areas in the country, and you can see that with the expansion of that tan area, of the areas under regime control, and especially key cities that through brutal tactics the regime was able to seize from rebels who then either surrendered or fled the country, with many choosing internal displacement, moving to Idlib province in northwest Syria, which you can see is that last sort of sliver of rebel control in the salmon color up there in the northwest corner. And in 2020, Turkey and Russia, allies of one side or the other, brokered a ceasefire that brought to more of a reduction the hostilities between opposition and regime. And although the regime continued to bomb Idlib province, where the rebels were held up in that last enclave, many rethought that the conflict was increasingly over, that the regime had won, the opposition were defeated, and many countries around the world began to normalize relations, thinking that the Assad regime was there to stay. This is the context of war, of death, of suffering, in which over 500,000 people were killed, a country was left in ruins, and more than half of the population were forced to flee as refugees. And this is where many of us in the US and elsewhere began to hear the term Syrian refugee. That was an expression that didn't really exist before 2011, and in many ways, Syria and refugee became two words stuck together for many of us following the news. So approximately 14 million people were displaced over these years. At least half were internally displaced. They were forced to flee their homes, but were still remained inside Syria, maybe in tents, maybe living with family, maybe renting apartments, but could not return to their original homes. The large majority of those who became refugees outside Syria remained in the countries on Syria's borders, the largest number in Turkey, and also large numbers in Lebanon and in Jordan and in other places in the Middle East. Some 1.5 million Syrians made it to Europe as asylum seekers or as migrants, the largest number in Germany, followed by Sweden and elsewhere, leaving almost 500,000 Syrian refugees who made it to other places, including Maine and other places around the world. So it was this context of war, of suffering, and mass displacement that as the years passed and I continued doing my interviews, gathering Syrian stories about their lives, led me increasingly to think about the question of home, because I could hear in my Syrian interlocutors them thinking deeply about home and the meaning of home. Why home? Public interest in wars is typically strongest during their outsets or some particularly horrific, dramatic peaks. But then interest often wanes, which was what happened in Syria, which dropped out of the headlines for many years. But as military battles decline, new battles become palpable for those who survive war, like the need to make sense of it all, to extract meaning from loss, and find oneself amidst a shattered world. In other words, to find home. I spent several years asking Syrians, what does home mean to you? And I invite each of you to think about that question as well. What does home mean to you? You might find that you've never really thought about that question before, the meaning of home. Not just where is home, but what is home? And indeed, the more that you are rooted in a clear-cut home, the less you probably have to ask yourself that question deeply and critically. And here I think a lot about the culture geographer Yi-Fu Tuan, who defines rootedness as being, quote, unreflectively secure and comfortable in a particular locality. For Tuan, when you're completely at home, you don't ask yourself whether or not you're at home. You simply are. Refugees, however, typically don't have the luxury of being unreflective about home. For Syrians, until 10 months ago, most refugees could no longer go back to the towns or villages they once called home. Their homes or entire neighborhoods might no longer exist, or the people who made it a home were no longer there because they were scattered all over the world. And they were compelled to build new lives and livelihoods in places where before they maybe never even dreamed they would step foot. So all of this forced people to think a lot about home, whether they wanted to or not. Listening to their stories and their deep reflections was a way that I think that non-refugees can learn about what it means to be displaced, but more than that, can learn from displaced people about matters of universal human concerns, matters that touch every single human life, like the question of home. So my new book argues that those forced to flee home as refugees have special wisdom on the meaning of home. The violent dislodging of people from their established moorings can bring them to uncover truths about belonging that simply are more obscured in settled times. In context of forced migration, discovering what home is can demand discovering who one is, how one finds peace, what matters most, and what one can do without when you have to do without it. It's a kind of awareness that does not come without adversity, soul-searching, even pain. Home, in other words, takes work. And when people arrive at something that they feel is home, it's the home they worked to make. And that's the meaning behind the title of the book. Seeing home in this light, as work, as struggle, and ultimately as an achievement, encourages us to appreciate all the work that refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers do to create belonging, have empathy for those who are still searching for home, and to learn from what they have to say. My book shares the stories and reflections of 38 Syrians around the world, and everyone has a different answer to the question, what is home? To give you just a taste, I'd like to share just one voice from the book, and that's the voice of Hani, who I interviewed in Chicago. And here's a shortened excerpt of his story, which appears in more length in the book. I chose this testimonial among so many powerful ones because it captures some of the heaviness of Syrians' experiences prior to December 2024. So just 1 year ago, when most assumed that they would not see the fall of the Assad regime in their lifetimes, and they faced the challenge of grappling with such incredible loss and finding the strength to move forward. And along the way, creating wisdom about home that can be instructive for all of us. So here are Hani's words. He said, "When you're inside the conflict or you're escaping, you think only of survival. It's fight or flight. Your brain says, throw this to the back of your mind. Then, when you've settled somewhere, it comes back to you. Sometimes it comes back heavily, sometimes slowly. I think guilt is part of life for everybody who survived, even if they don't recognize it yet. We will always feel like, I could have done something differently, or I could have helped this one person, but didn't. Then you try to trace that person again, and you can't find him. Guilt makes you doubt things, doubt yourself. You wonder, why did we do any of this? We lost so much and for nothing. The whole conflict started for a reason, and we came out empty-handed. This is what they don't understand in the countries where Syrians went. They think that when you arrive somewhere, you should just switch your mode completely. Like speak German within 6 months. Become very open. Talk to people. But people left an entire life behind them. Most host countries don't want to hear this. They're like, you are safe now. Why are you being so negative? You should be happy. Yes, of course I should be happy. I am happy. But I'm also guilty and sad. All of this challenges you. It challenges your religion, your beliefs, everything. Some people survive that challenge and succeed. Some do not. They say home is where the heart is. I don't believe that. Maybe for some people, the two go together, but they don't necessarily. My heart is with my wife and my kid. My wife is from here. My daughter was born here. I love them. They're the best thing that ever happened to me. But does that mean it's home? It could mean home in the future, but it doesn't now. You can't just decide overnight, I'm going to make it feel like home. Home is the details that you don't think about until you lose them. The details that I lived with my whole life. My elementary school, my high school, my seat in the library at college, the store on the corner where the guy gives me something and I pay him tomorrow because he knows who I am. All of these details. This is what makes it feel like home. They happened because of everything around them, because of the community we lived in. These details, you can't create them. It's like if you went out and said, I want to fall in love. It's never going to happen. It happens by itself. Home happens like that. Suddenly you have that feeling, I'm here. But I try to find something that I can relate to. Back home, I went to the river. Here, I go to the lake. Okay, Lake Michigan is not the Euphrates, but it's a body of water. So I run by the lake. It means something to me. If we barbecue every day in the summer, we'll make memories here, too. So in sharing voices such as these, the home I work to make helps put us in the shoes of many Syrians as of 10 months ago, when many came to feel, as Hani expressed it, that they lost so much and for nothing, or even felt guilty of having risen up against dictatorship in the first place. And it's by putting ourselves in this feeling, in this sense, that we can try to appreciate the enormity of the shock when, in just 11 days, the Assad regime was toppled and collapsed. So, what happened? On November 27, 2024, the rebels in Idlib province, in that northwest province, began a lightning speed military operation. Rebels broke out of Idlib and advanced, and in 10 hours captured 20 towns and villages from the Assad regime. They continued, and by the second day had captured 40 towns and villages. On the third day, they captured Aleppo, the largest city in Syria, and then they kept going. And meanwhile, other rebel groups that they were coordinated with captured towns in northeast Syria, and others came from the south, capturing areas of the south, marching towards the capital, Damascus. And in town after town, government forces simply collapsed. They fled, soldiers took off their uniforms and ran away, and the regime fell town by town. Until on December 8th at 6:18 in the morning in Damascus time, rebel forces got on television and announced to the world that Bashar al-Assad had gotten on an airplane and fled the country. The regime had fallen. There were immediately celebrations across Syria and across the Syrian diaspora, where communities went out into the streets for hours and hours. The next Friday, there were even larger celebrations, and this is a scene from central Damascus with cars and people as far as the eye can see and fireworks celebrating Syrians' freedom. My own conversations with Syrians trying to capture what this felt like, there's so many words, so many stories. I'm still processing them. Syrians are still processing them. People say again and again, no one slept for days. Certainly no one slept that last night. There were tears of joy. And interestingly for me, people invoked the expression that I heard so much when I did interviews about the start of the uprising in 2011. People said again, La Yusuf, you simply can't put in words this feeling, that knowing that this monster in so many ways, this regime, is done. How did all of this happen? Well, there are lots of interpretations. Mine is that this was really the result of the confluence of three main factors. That once seeming this unstoppable, unremovable political system collapsed like a house of cards so quickly was a result of these three factors. Internally, the rebel movement had gotten stronger and more organized. Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is the outgrowth of al-Qaeda, so it has an extremist Islamist past and began from that trend and that tradition, had become the largest rebel group in Idlib province, and over many years began a massive campaign to restructure itself and other rebel forces as a more conventional fighting force, creating specialized units of special forces, of a drone unit, of a military doctrine. So they improved their training, their capabilities, their planning, and were becoming more and more capable as a fighting force. During these years where we all looked at Syria as a frozen conflict, they were getting stronger. And meanwhile, the regime was getting weaker and weaker, in part because enormous economic crisis over many years. The regime was increasingly a narco state, basically held together by revenues from the trade of the drug Captagon. It was hardly even paying its own soldiers. So when the time came of advancing rebels, soldiers who could barely have enough salary to feed themselves said, am I going to fight on behalf of this regime, took off their uniforms and essentially fled. And more people that had maybe once supported the regime saw that they were not getting anything out of it. It was existing for its own sake and economically was basically bankrupt. So here are two internal factors, and as well, there's an external factor that the entire environment of the Middle East, politics landscape had changed, that allies that had for a very long time helped prop up the Assad regime were no longer able to come to its rescue. Russia was more focused on the war in Ukraine. The Lebanese group Hezbollah and the state of Iran had been severely weakened in years of war and strikes by Israel after October 7th. So in that context, these allies that had been so critical for the Assad regime were simply not in a position to fight on its behalf and basically stood on the sidelines as the regime collapsed. So what seemed impossible became possible, and everything changed. How do we understand events in Syria since then? I can say this is extremely confusing and extremely overwhelming for all of us who follow Syria and for Syrians themselves. I'll try to share some observations based on my many conversations with my Syrian interlocutors, the analyses I've been following, and also my own month-long trip to Syria, where I was until just about 3 weeks ago. And many say that Syria is now undergoing a kind of rebirth. In fact, I spoke just this morning to a friend in Damascus, and she said, it's as if we're still in labor before this birth. And I think this idea of Syria being in labor captures, well, I've never had children, so I don't know. But what I'm imagining labor as the pain and the struggle, but also this amazing hope of possibility of a new life that could be emerging. So here are some things to help us all follow this confusing and difficult situation. Initial transition steps. So Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was the largest, most organized, strongest rebel group that led this advance, the military battle that ultimately led to the collapse of the regime, immediately created a new caretaker government in Damascus. There was a quite seamless transition of the then prime minister from the Assad regime, giving power to this government that slowly started to manage the affairs of this new state. In January, there was a large conference or meeting called the Conference of the Victory of the Syrian Revolution, attended by the commanders of most armed rebel groups, as well as prominent officials in the new caretaker government. They appointed Ahmed al-Shara, who you see here in the picture, who was the leader and founder of HTS, as the interim president of Syria. And that large conference also announced the dissolving of the Syrian army and security agencies of the Ba'ath ruling party to try to reestablish the army and security forces on a more national basis. It also announced the dissolving of all of these armed factions, saying these armed rebel groups no longer exist, they no longer exist. As Ahmed Shara very famously said, the revolution is over, now is the stage of building the state. And then there were other key events then in this interim transitional phase. In March, Shara, as the new president, formed a committee to write a new interim constitution. They drafted that, what's called constitutional declaration, and he signed it into power, announcing the terms of the new political system and its guiding principles for a transition period that would last 5 years. So Syria now had an interim constitution to last 5 years before some perhaps new constitution or new political system is established. Later that month in March, Shada also appointed a new cabinet of 23 ministers, which had some recognition of Syria's multicultural diversity. There was one member of the Alawite sect, of the Druze religious group, of a Christian minister, a Kurdish minister, one woman, two prominent civil society activists, one person checking nearly all of these boxes, but also the key posts. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs, of Defense, and Interior remained in the hands of HTS loyalists. So some diversity, but also some signs of a centralization of power. So by March, you had a new government up and running and a new constitution to guide the affairs of state. So for the first 3 months or so, many Syrians I talked to at least still felt a sense of euphoria, of a new freedom of expression, people talking with each other, speaking online, tremendous sense of hope, a sense of disbelief that this transition happened with really remarkably minimal bloodshed. There were some attacks here and there, but for many years, many had warned, if Assad ever falls, Syrians are going to destroy each other, there's going to be a bloodbath, and that, relatively speaking, did not happen. So there was tremendous joy and pride. But there are some crucial events that happened from March onward that created more doubt and fear and even shock and despair that live alongside the hope and joy, and that captures some of the complexity of the moment. So I'd like to discuss some of these more difficult, even despair-inducing events, but at the same time want to emphasize in talking through this violence since December 2024, I in no way want to minimize the crimes of the previous half century. If I were to go through all of the crimes and the massacres of the Assad regime, I would be speaking probably until next month. So that is the context to talk a little bit more about this very real part of the sadder story since December. As a Syrian colleague of mine recently put it, doctors don't necessarily spend a lot of time talking about what works well in a patient's health. Sometimes they try to focus on the problems, to diagnose the problems, to help things improve and to get more healthy. So in that spirit, some very difficult things that have happened in Syrians' transition. First, just a little bit of context. The president appointed a committee to try to organize what happened in February, a national dialogue conference, the idea of bringing together Syrians of different backgrounds to try to talk through some of the difficult matters of going forward as a nation. And what happened was essentially a one-day meeting of this national dialogue conference. Several hundred Syrians of different backgrounds came together to talk about issues like transitional justice, reforming institutions, the role of civil society. And it was historic in many ways, but also came under a lot of criticism. Then many said it was rushed and insufficient. Invitations went out like 48 hours before people could actually come to the conference. It was not sustained. It was a one-day affair. When I looked at the schedule of what Syrians were supposed to accomplish for national unity in one day, and I thought, I've had faculty meetings and retreats that have lasted longer than the agenda for this conference. So it was a historic and important step, but many criticized it was far, far, far from what Syria needed as a serious, sustained process where people could come together, talk about their pain, talk about their aspirations, and really dig into a country that suffered so much internally. That was something of a background of this issue of national dialogue, national reconciliation, not being dealt with perhaps seriously enough that there were two major incidents of sectarian-motivated massacres that have claimed the life of up to 3,500 people, in addition to other incidents that have been more ongoing. But here are the two major events that have been turning points of the transition process. In March 2025, in the coastal areas of Syria, which is the area where the Alawite minority is traditionally concentrated. This is a religious minority from which Bashar al-Assad and the Assad family came. and was disproportionately represented in the state and especially the army and security services. The HTS caretaker government had invited what they called former regime elements, and especially those in the army and security forces, that if they surrendered their weapons and hadn't committed major crimes during the regime era, they could get amnesty. But thousands did not seek amnesty in that way. And these individuals connected to the former regime launched a kind of insurgent attack in March against government forces, military forces of the new government. The government dispatched its forces to the scene. It also called for the mobilization of volunteers to come to the scene on behalf and fight back against these regime elements. So thousands of people flooded in to the area, including some rebel groups known for undisciplined and predatory behavior, some foreign jihadists who were also on the ground, thousands of civilians, and they engaged in revenge killings, mostly against Alawite civilians, who clearly had nothing to do with this insurgency. So there were tales of house-to-house raids, killings, lootings, videos of bodies piled into the streets, killings on identity with forces asking someone, "What's your religion?" and given their answer, perhaps shooting them. Afterwards, President Shara said basically all the right things. Those who've committed, there's no place for killing civilians and the innocent. Those who've done these killings will be held accountable, but there has not been any real accountability until now. In July, there was another episode. There are many contradictory narratives, polarized interpretations. I'm still struggling to understand what happened in Sweda province, which is the majority of the Druze religious minority in southern Syria. But as best as I can understand, the key background is that Sweda had become semi-autonomous during many years of the war and had many different armed groups. The new authorities in Damascus essentially wanted to dismantle these groups, assert their authority over the area. And many of the armed groups and members of the Druze minority wanted more guarantees of political participation and inclusion. They saw the government as essentially one color, as increasingly centralized of just this HTS group, and wanted more guarantees that they would be able to have secure rights and also really a seat at the table of decision making. So there was something of a standoff of the government wanting to assert their authority and people in the community wanting more guarantees of political inclusion. This sort of reached a crisis point in an incident at a checkpoint that led to clashes between members of the Druze religious minority in this province and members of Bedouin tribes. The government intervened nominally to assert authority and order, but basically sided with Bedouin tribes vis-a-vis Druze, again leading to violence of many days, atrocities, some 2,000 people killed, dozens of Druze majority villages burned, 150 or so thousand people displaced, and until now a kind of siege in this area where basic supplies are blocked from getting in. To add complexity to all of this, one of the Druze leaders who's most outspoken opposed to the Damascus authorities vocally sought support from Israel for their protection of the community, heightening other Syrians' criticism and accusation against the community. So it's wrapped up in regional politics too. In both of these incidents there, in the coast and in Sweda, there were fighters who committed atrocities and filmed themselves doing so, and these videos went online. And the title of this slide captures one incident that went viral and has been the source of a lot of soul-searching and discussion and debate among Syrians around the world. And that was a case in which armed men came upon a man sitting on the ground during the course of these days of fighting and asked him, "Are you Sunni or Druze?" And the man initially responded by saying, "Brother, I'm Syrian." And the armed men get pretty frustrated and they keep saying, "What do you are you Sunni or Druze? Are you Sunni or Druze?" And when he says, "I'm Syrian," you hear the man in the video saying, "What do you mean by Syrian?" "Ish yani Suri?" And the man finally replies, "Brother, I'm Druze," and he's shot dead. So this question, and here's the picture from that, of what do you mean Syrian? What does it mean to be Syrian, is something that many are asking themselves of now. So these events have been very confusing, but there are increasing now journalistic reports and human rights reports. And there's a lot of questions about the role of the government or government-affiliated forces in all of this. If there are those who are somehow connected to or loyal to the government in Damascus that have a role in committing these crimes against civilians, is this because this is, why is this happening? Why isn't the government stopping this? Is there a lack of will of stopping those within their own ranks from carrying out attacks? Or is there a lack of capacity because they're not fully in control, because they went from being a rebel group to a government of a whole country very, very quickly and are still building their institutions? Is there command and control from the top to the bottom? Is there control horizontally of not just HTS, but different rebel groups that are semi-autonomous that were a part of the coalition that overthrew the government, but don't necessarily see eye to eye? The president continues to say all the right things in condemning these human rights violations, of wanting security and order, of saying there's a Syria for all Syrians, but there are questions about why this is happening and what responsibility the government bears in all of this. And there are not clear answers. There are more questions than answers. And ultimately, these matters are not just military and security, they're political. What is a vision of political inclusion and participation for Syrians of all different religious and ethnic backgrounds to feel a part of this country and to be able to answer in a positive way, what is the meaning of being Syrian? What is the national identity that holds the country together? So this is a grave challenge, but there are still more grave challenges facing this process of labor as the country gets off the ground. There are questions of sovereignty. As you can see in the map here, the government in Damascus does not control all of the country. There are major parts here you see in purple that remained under the control of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces that was allied with the US, that was part of our partners in the fight against ISIS, and then assumed control over the territory that had been in the Islamic State, and still other groups in different parts. So there's not even complete sovereignty. In addition, Israel has been bombing Syria in different ways since the fall of the regime on December 8th, and has even occupied some areas adjacent to the Golan Heights in the south. And this is ongoing in the past 10 months. Another huge question for so many Syrians is what form of justice can help this society heal, have truth about the crimes of the past, accountability for crimes of the past, and also those of the present. And a major focus of this are those who were imprisoned in regime prisons and disappeared. There are families of some 180,000 people who remain missing. There's constant work by families of the disappeared who want some sort of information about their loved ones. Are they alive? Are they dead? If dead, how did that happen? Where are they buried? They want graves to be able to visit. It's just a source of a huge amount of pain. Hardly any Syrian family does not have at least know someone who has disappeared. And most of those disappeared were by the regime. So this is part of the call for transitional justice. But the question also remains, whose crimes? Well, the huge bulk of crimes were committed by the regime. Even those in power in Damascus also have committed crimes. The current government does. Will transitional justice also hold them accountable for their crimes? A huge problem is simply this country is economically in tatters. Some 90% of the population is below the poverty line. There is simply no work. There are people who can barely feed themselves. A huge part of economic recovery is also the amount of rebuilding. Some 330 destroyed buildings, many, many of them apartment buildings and homes. So this is a picture that I took in the city of Homs just last month. And walking through the streets of Syria, you see mile upon mile upon mile of destroyed buildings, destroyed homes, where you can look and say, who used to live in this building? Where did they go? What was the process of saving and building an entire family, a livelihood for a lifetime to build this home? What happened to that? Where are they now? Will they ever come back? And in so many of these destroyed buildings, you can see the pock marks, and then you see, as you see here, laundry, or sometimes plants on the balcony. And some people have come back and are living even in a building destroyed like this one. You wonder about the architectural health of the building and if the whole thing will fall down. But some people have come back and are trying to live there, and you might see new blocks. But the economic aspects and the impoverishment people have experienced is just mind-boggling. In addition to the huge destruction of infrastructure, there are electricity cuts every day. Some people have some electricity, some don't. Some people have water, some don't. Some communities don't have schools, and without schools will refugees return. So the country is in vast need. President Trump's announcement of a lifting sanctions is creating some hope for space that the country can recover, but it's a country in tatters. Which then brings the question of refugee return. The estimates are that since December, some 1 million refugees from outside the country have returned home. Some 1.8 million internally displaced people have come home. But that means some 12 million or so have not. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees reminds us that refugee returns must be safe, voluntary, and dignified. Any talk about sending refugees home must ask, to what would people be returning? And do they even have towns or homes that they can return to? But despite these difficult questions and hard reality, many countries in Europe are beginning to restrict asylum or freeze asylum, and in the United States as well, they've announced the end of temporary protection status for Syrians who are here under that status. Just a few quick things to end with. One exciting thing about there being more freedom in Syria and people being able to talk, it's the first time ever in Syria's modern history people can do opinion polls because people aren't afraid to talk. And researchers can do their work to ask Syrians, what do they want? What is Syrian opinion? So this is the first poll that has just come out based on research done last past summer. What is the best political system for Syria? You can see the huge majority want a democratic system. This is what Syrians want. Asking Syrians, how do you feel? This captures some of the roller coaster of emotions. That people are feeling everything all at the same time. So if you look at the blue color to the left, you'll see that the majority of Syrians, and this is done inside Syria, not external refugees. The majority feel hope, feel safety, feel joy, and feel happiness, and feel relief. But they also feel, at least some of the times, anxiety, fear, and uncertainty. And some significant minorities feel that most of the time. So this is part of the indescribable roller coaster of emotions of this moment. At the same time, the majority of people, at least as of July and August, felt like things were headed in the right direction overall. And especially important for me, because as I said, I've spent 14 years talking to people who had to flee home, or who, having fled home and not being able to return home, didn't even know how to answer for themselves the question of what home is. Now, the large majority of Syrians in Syria don't want to flee. They want to stay, they want to rebuild their country, they want to work for this better future. So for me, after 14 years of talking to people who had to flee, I think, I guess I need to write a third book. So I'll end there. Thank you so much.